Why do we love Thanksgiving? What is it about Thanksgiving that brings that warm nostalgia that makes us want to go back to our childhood? Family all comes together. You know, we reminisce about the greatness of the United States and all of these different things. So is Thanksgiving a good thing or a bad thing? It's a very good thing. It brings people together. You have a time where you can come together and in camaraderie and all those different type of things. Because should we have seasons where we give God thanks? Yes. Yes, we should. But what we're going to do, we're going to find out that the conditions that inaugurated what we call Thanksgiving are the same conditions that we're living in today's society. And the same things that were incorporated during these societies is the same thing that Satan is going to inculcate in this last generation. Now we're going to find out what this is. Now we're generally told that Thanksgiving was merely the Puritans. They were doing all of these gracious things. And they had the Indians and they shared all of these wonderful principles with them. And everything was kumbaya. Now, was that the case? Now, let's see. How much do Americans spend on Thanksgiving? Now, how much do you think we spend on Thanksgiving every year? 30 million? 40 million? Let's see. This says Thanksgiving, this is in 2020. Thanksgiving played out mostly in small gatherings, often limited only to members of the same households who had been riding out the pandemic together. This says, although the spirit of the holiday is about gratitude and family, the reality is that Thanksgiving isn't cheap, especially for the millions of Americans who plan to host or to travel. America's turkey tab is approaching 1 billion. Now, mind you, this is just one day. Just one day. We're spending about $1 billion for one day. Now, do you think that generally on Thanksgiving we're practicing temperance? Do you think that we're being temperate in our eating and drinking? We're only taking a small slither of the pie and taking a little bit of the ice cream? Or do you think that we're eating so much food that some of us are getting sick? According to Finder, 292 million Americans, or 88%, will gobble down turkey on Thanksgiving. In total, the country will spend about $927 million, 46 million unfortunate birds. That's a big increase over the 783 million America shelled out for turkeys in 2020. Do you think that the price is going to be higher in 2020? Yes. Yes, it is. Now, these are just some statistics. Now, does this look like a very happy gathering of family and friends? Very happy gathering of family and friends. They're socializing. They're coming together. It's very beautiful. Friends are also family, how the unofficial holiday, Friendsgiving, has grown. So this talks about that besides just catering to our family, we're also catering to our friends. Everybody get it? While Thanksgiving is a time to give thanks around a meal with family, Friendsgiving is a time for drinks, food, and games with friends. This says it's tradition to see friends and make them a priority just as family is. It's fun. We play games, we drink, we eat turkey and ham. So it talks about all of these different things that happens during the Friendsgiving. Now, notice this statement from Great Controversy. Atheists, infidels, and apostates oppose and denounce God's law. Now, is that true? It's very true. But the results of their influence prove that the well-being of man is bound up with his obedience of the divine statutes. So it doesn't matter how much man may try to give the impression that following God's law is not important, it's critically important. Critically. Those who will not read the lesson from the book of God are bidden to read it in the history of what? So in the history of nations, it proves how important the law of God is. Has anybody ever heard of something called the Bolshevik Revolution? Anybody ever heard of a man by the name of Joseph Stalin? Anybody ever heard of the French Revolution? Anybody ever heard of a man by the name of Voltaire or Rousseau? Those experiences and many others has helped to prove that atheism is not the path that human beings need to go down. Is that correct? Yes, it is. So if we're not willing to read it from the Bible, God says, I'll just give you history, and hopefully if you're paying attention, you can learn the lesson from history. You know what? Let's turn to Ecclesiastes. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes. We're going to read in chapter 1, starting in verse 9. Now, do you think understanding history is critically important? Yes. Do you know that as Americans, we are some of the most ignorant people when it comes to history, especially our own history? All right, in verse 9 it says, the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the what? So all of this crisis that is about to come upon us and the entire world, the principles that are being inculcated is that which has already been in the past. Does that make sense? Okay. This is taken from The Guardian. This says the gooey overlay of sweetness over genocide, the myth of the first Thanksgiving. So again, we're told that the Puritans, that they were all of them. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, God used the Puritans. But we are essentially told that all of the Puritans were just in kumbaya with the Native Americans, and that this was a very benevolent time where only goodness and mercy and truth reigned prominent. In 1970, Massachusetts was preparing to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers on the Mayflower. Question: why did the Pilgrim Fathers, why did they leave England? Who are they being persecuted by? The Church of England. The Church of England. Now, they were escaping persecution, but we're going to find out that instead of extending civil and religious liberty to those that they lived around, they persecuted the people that they were around. Does that make sense? The 53 surviving men, women, and children who had left England in search of religious freedom are credited with starting America's first successful colony in Plymouth. Their voyage to the so-called New World is celebrated by many Americans still as a powerful symbol of the birth of the United States. Now, has anybody here studied the Puritans or the history of the Puritans? Now, the Puritans greatly helped to initiate the moral fabric and framework of American society. And part of the reason why this National Sunday Law is going to be so prominent in the United States is because of the religious legacy of the Puritans. Now, the Puritans got their theology from a man by the name of John Calvin. Anybody have heard of John Calvin? Unfortunately, even though God used John Calvin was not a proponent of religious freedom. It was even so much to the point that in Geneva, he burnt to death a man by the name of Michael Servetus because he disagreed with him theologically. So they invented a member of the Wampanoag Nation, or People of the First Light, the loose confederation of southeastern New England tribes whose ancestors were immortalized as the friendly Indians who welcomed the Pilgrims and feasted with them at the first Thanksgiving. This says, James said that he would attend on the condition he told the truth. That included the fact that the Pilgrims robbed ancestral graves before establishing America's hometown. In the abandoned native village of, I don't know how to pronounce that. Yeah, thank you, Patuxent, thank you. Where an estimated 90% had perished from a European originating pandemic they called the Great Dying. So we get the point that unfortunately there were a lot of other influences that the Puritans brought with them besides their desire for religious liberty. We're going to jump through this. So much history here. All right. Now, this is taken from a book. I didn't want to butcher this person's name, but this person who wrote this particular comment, they are Professor Emeritus at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. They wrote a particular book that we're about to quote from right here. Notice this. With American Puritans, indeed, we find for the first time the beginnings of a coherent ideology. An ideology that is based on the premise of the ultimate separation of America, the New World, from the corruption of the Old World. Does that make sense? Seeing their migration as an apocalyptic revelatory event, American Puritans were the first to accord America as a singular independent role as a sacred place in the history of salvation. Now, what does the word apocalypse mean? What does that mean? What does apocalypse mean? Okay, it means revelation. The word apocalypse does not mean the end of the world, as it's been construed to mean. It simply means revelation. This is why the book of Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is why, for instance, in Spanish, the book of Revelation is entitled Apocalypsis. Does that make sense? So the Puritans, they felt as though that their transference to the New World was actually a manifestation of Bible prophecy. Now, was it a manifestation of Bible prophecy? Yes, it was. Yes, it was. But we're sadly going to find out that they did not really understand the purpose as to why they came to this new world, but God still worked through those ignorances. This says geosophy. We're going to get a little technical here. Geosophy is to geography what historiography is to history. Was that confusing? It deals with the nature and expression of geographical knowledge, both past and present, regarding men's sense of terrestrial space. Geosophy, therefore, deals with human desires, motives, and prejudices towards space and time. So this is helping to explain the psychology behind the Puritans. Does that make sense? Religiography is religion that has to do with geographic actualities or the role of terrestrial space within the confines of religious thought and expression. The term geotheology signifies the theological nature and meaning of space. Geoteleology deals with the destiny of the world within a theocratic universe controlled and directed according to the providence of God. And that's the last point that we really want to focus in on. Unfortunately, the Puritans, they were of the mindset that God wanted them to establish a theocracy in the United States. Now, if you are running a theocracy, if you dissent from the established religion, what happens to you? If you dissent from the established religion in a theocracy, what happens to you? You're destroyed or killed. Does that make sense? So even Baptists and Quakers were persecuted in the Puritan colonies because they differed theologically from the Puritans. Does that make sense? All right. Now, this is taken from great controversy. It was the desire for liberty of conscience that inspired the Pilgrims to brave the perils of the long journey across the sea, to endure the hardships and dangers of the wilderness, and with God's blessing on the shores of America. Yet, honest and God-fearing as they were. So were they honest and God-fearing? Yes, they were. So is it possible to even do really bad things ignorantly and still be God-fearing? Did David practice polygamy? Did God punish him for his polygamy? He actually didn't. Now, but did God condone his polygamy? No. Now, was polygamy ever a part of God's original design? In the beginning, man had one wife, and that was it. That was it. Every experience of polygamy that we see in the Word of God, it always came with heartache. It always came with heartache. I mean, just imagine. I mean, for those women who are married here, could you imagine sharing your husband with another woman, let alone 5 other women? And then as a man having to deal with the jealousy of all of the wives, could you imagine the type of stress that would bring in the home? And it's so sad that Satan has many young people thinking that polygamy is a legitimate sexual orientation. So it says, yet honest and God-fearing as they were, the Pilgrims did not yet comprehend the great principle of religious liberty. Genuinely speaking, the only colony that was not set up as a theocracy was Rhode Island. Now, does anybody know who started Rhode Island? A man by the name of Roger Williams. Anybody ever studied Roger Williams? He's one of the great bastions of American liberty, along with a man by the name of Isaac Backus. This says, the freedom which they sacrificed so much to secure themselves, they were not equally ready to grant to others. Very few, even of the foremost thinkers and moralists of the 17th century, had any just conception of the grand principle, the outgrowth of the New Testament, which acknowledges God as the sole judge of human faith. Jesus was that great personage that installed the principle into humanity that civil government is to be separated from the religious power. To be separated from the religious power. Notice what great controversy goes on to say, but there's a reason why the Puritans were thinking like this. Now, they were escaping persecution from the Church of England. Now, where did the Church of England, what church did they come out of? Catholicism. Now, do you think that Catholicism cares a lot about religious liberty? No, they don't. Only their religious liberty. The doctrine that God has committed to the church, the right to control the conscience and to define and punish heresy, is one of the most deeply rooted of papal errors. One of the most deeply rooted papal errors is that the church has the right to control a person's individual conscience. We'll give a hypothetical. So if you are a person living in this COVID age and you decide that you don't want to get vaccinated, should you be coerced by your church to get vaccinated? You shouldn't be. Does that make sense? While the reformers rejected the creed of Rome, they were not entirely free from the spirit of intolerance. Now, do you think after all of these centuries, we have been divested of the spirit of intolerance? Unfortunately, we haven't. And it's going to culminate in a time of trouble such as never was. Yes. Point. All right, let's turn in our Bibles to the book of Revelation. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 13. We have so much to get through. I'm going to seek to not keep us too long. Revelation chapter 13, we're going to start in verse 11. The Bible says, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a what? Now, this beast, what nation is this representing? The United States of America. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to this verse 11, when do we say this is going to take place? In the future. But in principle, we as a nation have been speaking as a dragon from our very inception. Does that make sense? Now think about it. What were some of the things that we were doing as a nation that would denote that we were speaking as a dragon? Think. What was the greatest economic driving force of the American colonies? Slavery. Now, how is it possible that you could be subjugating human beings and be speaking as a lamb at the same time? Is that possible? It's not possible. And if you were instrumental in the mass genocide of the Native Americans, can you still be speaking as a lamb and not as a dragon? Does that make sense? All right. You see, because it's so important for us to get this historical context, because again, history is going to be repeated. This says a kind of church state was formed. So this is how the colonies operated. They operated as a church state. All the people being required to contribute to the support of the clergy, and the magistrates being authorized to suppress heresy. Thus, the secular power was in the hands of the church. It was not long before these measures led to the inevitable result, persecution. And this is part of the reason why we mentioned what we mentioned earlier today. In reality, in American politics, there really is no left-right. It's really just one uniparty, but it's expressed differently. And you see, the thing is, because what is termed the left, because they support abortion and all of these things that are clearly anti-Christian, and because the quote-unquote conservative Republican Party endorses, so-called religious liberty and all of this, we think that this is the party of God's religion. Does that make sense? But in actuality, they're funding different and the same things. All right. Now, this was, or currently is, a professor of American history at the University of Hawaii. He wrote a book called American Holocaust. Notice what this man says. Now, remember, history is going to be repeated. The destruction of the Indians of Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. Does that make sense? That is why, as one historian aptly said, far from the heroic and romantic heraldry that customarily is used to symbolize the European settlement of the Americas, the emblem most congruent with reality would be a pyramid of skulls. Now, who is accredited with discovering the New World? Now, we've all heard of Christopher Columbus. What was the religion of Christopher Columbus? He was Roman Catholic. Now, what king and queen sent Christopher Columbus to the New World? Yes, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They sent Christopher Columbus to find the New World. Now, was his main purpose to teach the indigenous people about Christianity? It was just another reiteration of Catholic imperialism. That's all it was. They were not spreading Christianity. And unfortunately, the Puritans, though having the Word of God, partook of these same practices, sadly. But it was a Golgotha the Puritans delighted in discovering, not only because the diseases they brought with them from England left the Puritans themselves virtually unaffected, but because the destruction of the Indians by these plagues was considered an ambiguous sign of divine approval for the colonial endeavor. You see, the Puritans, they considered themselves to be Israelites entering into Canaan. So if they were the Israelites entering into Canaan, who were the Indians? The ravaging savages that needed to be driven from the land. So in light of that, sadly, that's how they acted towards the indigenous. And you have to remember, they genuinely thought that they were doing the right thing. Not all of them. I don't want to, paint it with a broad brush. Some of them knew what they were doing was wrong. But not a few of them genuinely thought that this was God's will in the genocide of the Native Americans. Now, again, we want to understand the psychology of this. During the time of the Roman Catholic Inquisition during Europe, the people were literally educated to believe that they were doing the will of God. Jesus even said that those who put you out of the synagogue and kill you will think that they are doing God's what? God's service. So here at the end of time, when we start to be persecuted, the people persecuting us are going to be so deceived that they will genuinely believe that they are doing the work of God. Is that serious? That's very serious. This says, as the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony wrote in 1934, the Puritan settlers, numbering at the time in all about 4,000 souls upward, were in remarkably good health. Through the Lord's special providence, there hath not died above 2 or 3 grown persons and about so many children all the last year. It being very rare to hear of any sick of agues or any other diseases. But he not in passing, as for the natives, they are near all dead of the what? Of the smallpox. So as the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess. So again, the destruction of the natives, according to them, was God's divine approval on their endeavor. Does that make sense? Are we all alert? I see some of us dozing off a little bit. I know we just ate. By the grace of God, we're just praying that hopefully we can still be engaging. I know it's a lot of information. All right, it's coming to a close, this statement. Added the Puritan divine. That was another word used for pastors during that time. They were called divine scholars. Cotton Mather, as he celebrated the event many years later in his post, in a little more than an hour, 1 hour, 500 or 600 of these barbarians, this was the language they used to describe the natives. They called them barbarians, were dismissed from a world that was burdened with them. Now, principally, did God die for the salvation of the Native Americans? So what was the true disposition the Puritans should have had towards the natives? Their salvation. You see, God actually wanted it that as the Puritans were to come to the New World in love and kindness, they would have converted the natives to true biblical Christianity, and the natives would have voluntarily accepted Christ. And from that premise, this would have been a true Christian nation. Does that make sense? Mason himself counted the Pequot dead at 600 or 700, with only 7 taken captive and 7 escaped. It was, he said joyfully, the just judgment of God. All right. For among the many things that the warfare does, it temporarily defines the entire enemy population as superfluous and as expendable. So you see, any time a nation or group of people is seeking to take advantage of another group, they must dehumanize them. Does that make sense? When Egypt was subjugating the Hebrew people, did they have to demonize them first? You see, God has given us all a conscience. And when you have a conscience, can you literally see yourself beating and torturing other human beings for money and not be bothered by it? So in order to bypass your conscience, you first need to not see them as human beings, but you must see them as ravening barbarians. Does that make sense? All right. This says a redefinition that must take place before most non-psychopaths can massacre innocent people and remain shielded from self-condemnation. And nothing is more helpful to that political and psychological transformation than the availability of a deep well of national and cultural consciousness that co-signs whole categories of people to the distant outback of humanity. Does that make sense? You know, it's amazing. There's a person who just recently died named Queen Elizabeth. Everybody heard of that woman? Of course we have. It's amazing. I was watching a segment by a man by the name of Tucker Carlson. Anybody ever heard of Tucker Carlson? Now, this man does some good reporting, but unfortunately, he mingles it with such things that just confuse my mind. So he was talking about the British Empire. And he was saying that the British Empire was the most benevolent empire that has ever existed. And that the subjugation of the Indian people in Asia, that this was actually a benefit for them because the Indians were nothing more than savages before the British came there. That they had no civilization, that they were, stupid, they weren't intellectual. And because the British were able to come and give them, train stations and railways and all of these things, that we helped to bring the Indians into modernity. You see, this is the mindset that Satan implants in the minds of persons in order to use them for destructive ends. All right. This is a symbol of the Native Americans. This says admiration of Indian ways of living. Now, this is still this professor from the university in Hawaii. Notice what he says about the lifestyle of the Indians. Notice. Now, quick question. How many people here knew this history before we talked about it today? Okay, a little bit. Okay. Admiration of Indian ways of living, particularly their peacefulness, generosity, trustworthiness, and egalitarianism. So these Indians, they were peaceful, they were generous, and there's even records that talk about that they always wore a smile. Yes?
So that's not completely true, though.
Okay.
What about the wars in Rhode Island, which
Yeah.
between the 3 different Indian tribes?
Yeah.
Robert Williams tried to bring peace amongst the Indians themselves.
No, yes.
And then you
Yeah.
look at the Blackfeet,
Yeah.
they cut the hands off of children,
Yeah.
other Indian tribes, so there's a lot of paganism.
No, don't get me wrong. There's always nuance when it comes to these things. But what this professor is seeking to bring out is that, unfortunately, the categorization that is generally given to Indians is that essentially that they were nothing but savages. Does that make sense? Now, the reality is that sin affects human beings across the board. So it doesn't matter what civilization it is. There's always going to be war. There's going to be famine. There's going to be genocide. There's going to be rape. There's going to be all these things.
Some tribes
Yes.
were greatly advanced.
No, of course. Yes. Yes.
That were not as pagan as others.
Yes, exactly. And so this is bringing out the point now in the book of Romans chapter 1, it talks about how many of the heathen that they knew God by studying nature. Now, do you think that the Indians were studying nature? Yes, they were. This says all of which, now, quick question, who were the individuals who came to Jesus as a child? Were they members of the Jewish nation? Not talking about the shepherds, but the wise men. Who were they? Were they Hebrews? They were from the east. Now, they were not idolaters, but they were also not of the Hebrew people. But as a result of them studying the stars and all of these different type of things and studying the prophecies of Balaam, they came to a knowledge of God. You see, in every civilization, no matter how pagan, God has a few remnant persons that are spreading the light of truth. This says that led some eloquent early praise of Virginia's native people, albeit from a distinct minority of British observers. This says, while almost no Indians voluntarily lived among the colonists, the number of whites who ran off to live with the Indians was a problem often remarked upon. So because some of the colonists saw the state that the Indians were living in, they actually wanted to be amongst their society. All right, this is coming to a close. James Axtell has concluded that the whites who chose to remain among the natives stayed because they found Indian life to possess a strong sense of community, abundant love, and uncommon integrity. The most perfect freedom, the ease of living, and the absence of those cares and corroding solicitudes which so often prevail with us. And that's a direct quotation. All right, now we're getting down to the crux. Now, this is a symbol of the Puritan colonies at that time. Now, does anybody know who this man is or was? Man by the name of A.T. Jones. We're getting down to a point. Notice what he says. There were so persecuted and abused by all classes as well as by the officers of the law that in 1608 they fled to Holland, speaking of the Puritans, stopping first at Amsterdam and after going to Leiden in 1609. From there, a company of these pilgrims sailed and landed at Plymouth, New England in what year? 1620. The success of this venture suggested to the Puritans a new scheme. Was not here an opportunity to establish a complete and unabridged Puritan government? So again, just emphasizing the point that the Puritans did not understand the importance of separation of church and state. In 1629, a royal charter was obtained creating the government and colony of Massachusetts Bay in New England. And 406 people led by Francis Higginson were sent over, and Endicott became governor of the whole colony. A Puritan or Calvinistic government was at once established and put into working order. Does that make sense? It was therefore not at all strange that under the government of the Winthrop and Dudley in 1639, the following law should be enacted. To the end, this body of commons may be preserved. At the bottom it says, thus the polity became a theocracy. God himself was to govern his people, and the saints by calling were by the fundamental law of the colony constituted the oracle of the divine will. At the bottom, established the reign of the visible church, a commonwealth of the chosen people in the covenant with God. And that's from Bancroft. This was the Calvinistic system precisely. The preachers were not to hold office in itself, but they were to be the rulers of all who did. So it was just like the papacy. So all of the papal kings of Western Europe, they had to go to the Pope in order to get permission to rule their nations. And so in these Puritan colonies, everyone who ruled the colonies had to get permission from the authority of the Puritan pastors. For as no man could be a citizen unless he was a member of the church, and as none become members of the churches or even propounded to the congregation except they be first allowed by the elders, this was to make the preachers what? Supreme. And the same thing is happening today. Now again, do we as God-fearing Christians have an obligation to pray for our nation, whatever nation you live in, to pray for your elected officials and all these different things? But is it God's direct purpose for us to be getting so ingrained in politics that it deviates us from the preaching of the gospel? No, and unfortunately, that's what's taking place today. This says this was to make the preacher supreme. This is exactly the position they occupied. They were consulted in everything, and everything must be subject to their dictation. Anybody know who this woman was? Anybody know who that was? A woman by the name of Mary Dyer. She was a Quaker who was executed by the Puritans because she had a different religious belief than the Puritans, unfortunately. Notes from the archives, Mary Dyer executed on this day in 1660, June 1st, 1660. We're not going to read all this for the sake of time. And we read this before. The doctrine that God has committed to the church is one of the most deeply rooted of papal errors.